Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Canary. I'm a host and producer with FGCU here on campus. I've been around campus for almost since the beginning. I don't know if it's about as long as Lyn. Welcome to an evening with Lyn Millner and Jeff Guinn. We are here to we're here to help them tell the story of this connection that has been revealed between David Koresh and the Branch Davidians and Cyrus and the Koreshan unity. Do you guys want to talk about yourself a little bit first, or you want to?
I just want to talk about all these yummy people in this room. I've been gone since last May on sabbatical, and just seeing all of you guys is just a balm. It is just an absolute balm. So thank you for coming. And also, hi.
And I just want to say what a thrill it is to be here at the meeting of the Lyn Millner Fan Club.
So I'll also just say that I'm kind of, fangirling with this guy over here. And also want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting this, and for WGCU for allowing us to have this wonderful interviewer here, and for my department for supporting this. It's just great, and for Eagle TV, the Eagle News TV, who's here. Yeah, it's fabulous. Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, there are books that are available to be signed and purchased. So, and I will remind you repeatedly throughout, because that's always a great way to support your local and not so local author. So for starters, let's go. We will spend a lot of time talking with Lyn about the Cyrus T. Koreshan unity stuff, but we were talking beforehand, and a lot of people here weren't around. The older people, we remember the Waco siege and what happened. A lot of younger people don't really remember it. So Jeff, can you give us sort of the Cliff Notes version of how that played out? Just the not the prophecy side of it necessarily, but the siege and it was like 6 weeks almost, I think.
51 days. Longer than that. It will be 30 years ago, come April the 19th, that a building known as Mount Carmel, and most of the people inside it, identifying themselves as Branch Davidians, burned to the ground pretty much in public view in Waco, Texas, at a time when CNN had become the first 24/7 news operation, when the internet was first spreading its wings. In a lot of ways, this was one of the first tragedies that Americans could watch unfold in front of them from minute to minute. The 51 days prior to the tragedy at the end, please tell Steven Spielberg while I'm talking, he can call me about the movie rights later. Get so sick of that guy, he's pushy. Because the siege took up so much time, it became something that people all around the world were talking about and watching. Great questions were raised even during the siege. Originally, ATF Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had tried to raid Mount Carmel because the people inside were known to be in possession of illegal automatic weapons. They were breaking the gun laws of the country, and some disaffected Branch Davidians even suggested that at any moment they might come boiling out of Mount Carmel shooting civilians, because part of their belief was that they were led by the Lamb of the Book of Revelation, and they were going to help bring about the end time of the Book of Revelation in the Bible by battling the forces of Babylon, the United States government. What happened in Waco has fascinated us, me, ever since. How did it come to what it did? Who were all these people that were involved? And maybe even most importantly, Waco still affects us today. I remember watching, as I think most people did, with great shock and horror, the events January 6, 2021, the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. The leaders of the groups who were doing this, Proud Boys, others, all have said for years they became militant against their government because of Waco. The terrible things that the government had done to innocent gun-owning Christian American citizens. And it's true, ATF and FBI do deserve quite a bit of blame for the things that happened. But there's always been the question, was there a conspiracy? At some point, thanks, I think, to one of the finest journalism professors in the country and a great writer, you may guess her name, who wrote a brilliant book that I happened to read, I began to see that there were some things in common between my Koresh and some earlier Florida Koresh. But if we write history, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring facts before readers that help them understand not only what happened then, but how that connects to things that have happened ever since. If we don't understand the connections between events in history, how can we ever learn from mistakes we've made and try to do better? That's why I came to write the book, and that's why I'm so proud to be here tonight with a writer that I admire very much.
Real quick before we switch to Lyn, remind us how you found that book.
This one.
That's a key ingredient to this entire story.
History never happens in a vacuum. Think Thomas Edison and the car trips they took around the country in the late 19-teens, early 1920s that really changed America into a car culture. And I was up at the Edison archives at Rutgers University. And old Tom and Mrs. Tom were enthusiastic letter writers, and they kept copies of everything. And Mrs. Edison wrote about how her husband and Mr. Ford, and she always called him Mr. Ford because she hated him. She really did. She wrote about how my husband and Mr. Ford remained fascinated by this group in Estero. And my husband is very interested in the crops these people are raising. And Mr. Ford, of course, cares nothing for botany, only for mechanics, and wonders how do they preserve and sell these products. She said they have an odd name. They call themselves the Koreshians. Now here I am, a Texas boy, and you know what I did when I saw that word Koreshians? I thought, and I wrote one word, one line in my book, The Vagabonds, about this group, the Koreshians. Then the Wall Street Journal asked me to write an article about what I would consider the 5 best books written about cults in America. And I just started looking at some different books, and somebody said, well, I read one that's pretty good by somebody down in Florida. And so I did what all good Americans do. I got right on Amazon. And I ordered a book called The Allure of Immortality. And that sucker was brilliant. I mean, I read that book cover to cover. And I ended up with about 20 books that I thought I could possibly include in the best 5, but this was one of the ones I did. But even more than that, I was reading about Cyrus T, and even I could not miss certain things. Here was a book about someone who considered himself, or at least presented himself in a certain way, and reading the words that Lyn wrote, all I could think about was David Koresh in Waco saying these same things. It has to be, there has to be a link. It can't be coincidence. But how did David Koresh, who read the Bible and comic books, really, don't laugh. Well, actually, how did he find out about this guy? Because he had to. Word for word almost. I was listening to tapes experience of Koresh preaching Bible studies to his followers. And then I'm looking at Lyn's book. It's word for word. This cannot be possible unless somehow he knew about it happening.
And I'm just gonna chime in here. When I was writing my book, I was so frustrated not to be able to find a connection between David Koresh and Cyrus T. I knew that they were theologically similar. And by the way, we should stop here and say what Koresh means and why both men changed their names to Koresh. Each man, or did you explain that?
No, I figure you will when I get to your.
Oh, is it not my, it's not my turn to talk.
Sure, you can talk all you want. It's more interesting.
You're more interesting. Okay, but so Koresh is Hebrew for Cyrus, for the name Cyrus. Each man believed himself to be King Cyrus, the Bible guy who freed the Jews from Babylon. And so they believed themselves to be a modern day reincarnation of King Cyrus. And so they changed their name to Koresh. That's the connection. But I was so frustrated as I was writing the book that there were all these similarities. There was speculation even in the Washington Post that David Koresh had modeled himself after Cyrus T, after who I think of as my prophet, right? But there was no proof, and my students know this. I'm not going to accuse someone of plagiarism unless I have proof. And I dug everywhere. I did not read all 60,000 pages of the FBI transcripts that Jeff did. I do not have a research team. And I was focused on telling Cyrus T's story. So many people told me, no relation. Because, many people in Estero didn't want there to be a relation. And one man said, no relation between Cyrus T, our Cyrus, and the white wacko from Waco. Right? And I dug and I dug and I dug. And then, so I'd forgotten about it. And then I get a Google alert that my name has appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And I think that can't be. There's been a mistake. And I look up the article and it says that my book has been chosen as one of the top 5 books about cults in America. So I learned about this, well, I knew, obviously, about Jeff Guinn. I read his books, and one of his books had sat on my desk as I was writing the Koreshan book. And I thought, when I wrote the book, I thought maybe my mom would read it, And it turned out that Jeff Guinn had also read it, which was exciting. And then fast forward a few, months, a year and a half ago, Jeff came to campus to come to our archives. And we are going to geek out on archives here in a minute, I promise you guys. He came to visit our archives, and he got a message to me through Lyn Millner. Lyn, where are you? We love Lyn. And so he came to visit me, he came to the archives, and he handed me this book. And he said, have you ever seen this book? And I looked at it and I thought, well, yeah, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of publications from the Koreshanes. T had a printing press. He had more than one printing press. One that was not repossessed by creditors. And so they printed reams and reams and reams and reams of publications. But I had maybe run across this. It might have been in my bibliography. I didn't really, it wasn't a big one, right? But he had this book and he said, you wouldn't believe where this book was found. You want to pick it up from here?
So,
you guys are doing great.
But it's important to understand that the only reason we are is the smoothness of the questioning that opened it. As you can tell, we're very strict here, we like to see. I've decided, based on what I read, The Allure of Immortality, there has to be something. And I am going to find it. And I agreed with my publisher, Simon & Schuster, to do a book about the events at Waco to be published to coincide with the 30th anniversary, 2 years in the future. One of the first things I try to do when I'm doing such a book is I try to see what's been written on the same subject before. If people are writing all the things that I might want to write, there's no sense in me doing a book. I mean, if you're doing nonfiction, you ought to be breaking new ground. But I found that there were 3 academic scholars in America, very distinguished folks, who had written and studied the Branch Davidians in detail for decades. And I thought I would contact them to start. And since I'm a Texas guy, there was a fellow named J. Philip Arnold of Reunion Institute in Houston, Texas, associated with Rice University. And Dr. Arnold specializes in biblical history. And I was able to get his number, and I called him up, and we had one of those usual stuttering, incoherent conversations that 2 people who are interested in history but have absolutely no knowledge of the other one's work tend to have. We kept promising we're each going to read the other one's books right away. And after about 10 minutes of this sort of verbal dance, I said, just throwing it out there, say, have you ever heard of somebody named Cyrus in Florida? And he screamed, oh my God, do you know about him too? As a former journalist, being able to play dumb is one of the best things you can possibly do, because people want to explain. So I said in my best dumb voice, which is also my usual voice, what do you know about him? I can't find anything. And he started to pour out a fascinating story. When the siege was going on in Waco, David Koresh actually got on live radio a couple times to talk about his beliefs. And he talked about how he was the Lamb of the book of Revelation. He was the only one who could open the 7 seals, that this assault by ATF was fulfilling the prophecy that Babylon would do this. And when he talked about these things, Phil Arnold, who studied biblical history, got very worried. David Koresh said, we are now in the 5th seal. And if any of you read the book of Revelation, I've always felt it's best not to try to read it sober, because there's a lot of odd stuff there. When the 5th seal is opened by the Lamb, with only 2 more to go, that's when all sorts of horrific events begin happening on earth. The signal that God is about to bring about the end times. And Dr. Arnold thought, well, if he really believes this, the FBI does not understand what's motivating him. If they want to get him out of that building and his followers and nobody else dies, they need to know what he believes. So he went to Waco, and he actually went to the FBI agents to try to explain what this means, and they told him it was all Bible babble, and it didn't matter, and basically told him to go away. Dr. Arnold was depressed. He drove back to Houston, decided, I just can't think about it anymore, because he was so upset with the FBI, and he went to a bookstore, because he loves to read, and he loves baseball. Any baseball fans out there? Lyn Millner. He took down a book, bought it, about the House of David baseball team. And you're wondering, what in the hell does this have to do with Cyrus T? Well, now you're going to find out. House of David baseball team, early 1900s, made up of folks of different religious faiths who would come to town, play your baseball 9, your town baseball team, wouldn't charge admission, but they'd preach to you afterwards about their beliefs. And the 3rd baseman on the House of David team described himself as a Koreshan from Estero, a follower of Dr. Cyrus T, now known as Koresh, the Lamb of the book of Revelation, who will open the 7 seals. And Dr. Arnold said 2 words, the first of which was "oh," And he raced back to Waco. And he's thinking the whole time, somehow Koresh has heard of him. How can he do that? Koresh has been in Waco, which, folks, I love my native state, but we have certain towns in it where, book is considered a four-letter word. Waco's mostly one of them. How would somebody in Waco find out about these things? And what he did was he went to the library in Waco, McLennan County Public Library. It turned out that Cyrus of Florida, of Estero, had written any number of books, and his followers, after Teed's death, had put together a collection of Teed's prophecies, which they called Koreshanes, the New Age Religion. They self-published it, about 300 copies. Disappeared forever. That's what happens with self-published books. 1971, grandchild of one of the Koreshan followers decided to reprint a few hundred more copies of the book and send it out into the world. At the time that Dr. Arnold was looking for it in the Waco Library, only 8 library systems in America had a copy, all buried in their archives. One was New York, one was Chicago, one was Los Angeles, the big ones. And the 8th was tiny Waco McLennan County Public Library. Dr. Arnold asked if he could see the book, and they were told they lost it. Somebody had checked it out a few years earlier, underlined a bunch of passages in it, and brought it back to the library. Well, the library people were really upset, and they tried to erase out all the underlinings. And when a lot of the underlinings remained, they just kind of tossed it in a box in the basement, and there it stayed. And Dr. Arnold tried to tell the FBI about it. He knew a reporter from the Washington Post and told her about it. She wrote a one-day story. The FBI archives of their conversations, all 60,000 pages of the Koreshan conversations with negotiators, show that 10 days before the fatal fire, one of the negotiators mentioned to one of the Branch Davidians on the phone, hey, by the way, we've got this book about some other guy called Koresh. He said some of the same things as David. Do you want to see it? And this Branch Davidian, you can hear him on the tapes. Hey, David, the FBI says they've got a book about some other guy called Koresh. Koresh was they sent it in. But the FBI lead agent decided not to. If he had sent that in 10 days earlier, when Koresh's followers were holding out, if they had seen all the similarities, maybe things would be different. But the FBI guy made that decision. And even though the Branch Davidians kept asking for a couple days to have the book. Well, when Phil told me that, I had Lyn. There had to be something. So I went to Waco, explained who I was, and said, where do you keep all the books that you don't want people to see because they're embarrassing, but you don't throw them out? And we found that book with the passages underlined. And the passages underlined were word for word David Koresh's prophecies to his followers. I'm not talking about close, word for word. Then how does it get to Koresh? The prophet who led the Branch Davidians before Koresh, a 60-year-old woman named Lois Roden. Lois Roden got to be leader of the Branch Davidians by giving them a prophecy that she said was brought to her by an angel from God. This angel told Lois Roden that the Holy Ghost is female, which makes the Holy Trinity both male and female. It proves that God thinks women are just as important as men. Which is wonderful, except when I read that, I remembered something else Cyrus had written, which was an angel visited him, said that an angel came down, told him that the Holy Ghost was female, and word for word again. Years before David Koresh got to Mount Carmel, Lois Roden was stealing from Cyrus T. Then, going back into Archives of Baylor University to some of Lois Roden's newsletters she sent to her followers, it turns out she actually came to Estero and visited Koreshanes, and she wrote about them twice in her newsletter. There's a connection, and now we had the book. And now I had Lyn, I had the FBI archives, and suddenly I was getting credit for doing this wonderful thing, digging deep and finding out everything. That is like someone who put together Thomas Edison's light bulbs being called the genius, and Edison getting ignored, who was the one who made the great invention. So there are two heroes to this story of how the history got won. One is Phil Arnold, and the other one is sitting to my left. I think it would be time and very appropriate if Lyn would tell all of you a little bit about Cyrus Teague, the things he taught, and how he got to Estero, Florida, what happened then.
Let me frame that just a bit. Why did you write about it? And then let's talk about it.
Oh, I like that idea. I was, at the time, I was a freelance writer for magazines, and that's how I make my living. So I ate based on good stories that I found. So I had a poet friend tell me one time we were driving down the interstate, and we passed exit 123, and this poet friend said, "Oh, that's where Koreshanes State Park is. They believe they lived on the inside of the world." And I thought, well, he's a poet, right? I'm sure he's misunderstood something. And so, but then I remembered it when I got back, and I thought, well, that could be an interesting story, right? So I started looking into the Koreshanes, and I pitched an article to the Oxford American magazine, which I very much wanted to write for. Ended up writing for a different story. But they said, that sounds great. And so I started working on the story, and I quickly saw that 2,000 words, the average length of a magazine story for the Oxford American, was just not going to do much more than say, here's who the Koreshanes were, aren't they kooky? And I didn't want to do that, right? People had already done that, and the whole weird Florida thing, right? Which is great, you know. But I just started researching it, and about that time, there were some archives that had been released that nobody had ever gotten their hands on. This was just dumb luck. There were letters from Cyrus Teague that he had written back in the 1870s to his best friend in Binghamton. There were journals, there were photographs that no one had ever seen. There was a Bible that he had preached from. There were just tons of artifacts, ephemera, furniture, right? It was all coming out.
Where did that stuff come from?
A lot of it came from the College of Life. So there was this kind of mysterious building at Estero and Corkscrew. Some of you might remember it. And there was a kind of a makeshift sign almost that said College of Life on Corkscrew Road. And most people just kind of passed by it and thought, oh, I wonder what that is, right? That's weird. Well, it turns out College of Life was what Cyrus Teague called his college, which you could pay, I think, $50 and go to 6 weeks. You know, just go for 6 weeks and then get a certificate signed by Teague. So the College of Life was there, and it had released all of these archives, and some of them were in very bad shape. A lot of them went to Tallahassee, and eventually a lot of them made their way to the archives at this university, which is amazing. And I want to thank some of the archivists who are here today, and I want to recognize them. I have names. Archivists are cool. So all of these had been released. I was able to read their journals, look at their photos, read these letters. I could even tell how hard Cyrus Teague had pressed on the page when he was writing these letters. It was that amazing. So I could see what he emphasized. I could see what he underlined. I couldn't understand a word of some of the stuff that he wrote because he was very just flowery language, made-up language, obtuse stuff. But I was reading it, and so I thought, okay, 2,000 words, no way, right? These guys deserve more than that, because I started to see there were these people who gave up everything One woman gave up a personal chef. And left her husband, who was in no great shape, as it turns out, and to follow this guy, Cyrus Teed, who believed in equality between men and women. That was a very attractive draw for a lot of women, right? Because it was hard to be a woman in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, right? If you left your husband, you would lose everything. So they could join with Cyrus Teed. Where was I? So you were asking me why I wrote this. I'm sorry. Cyrus Teed is a bit of a rabbit hole. Just a bit of a rabbit hole. So I kind of told the Oxford American, I tried to explain all of this to the editor, and they said, yeah, that's not going to work for us. You can't write 50,000 words. But luckily, the University Press of Florida said, yeah, we want that story. So I started working on the book, and I also found that the Koreshanes were covered in the Chicago Tribune. They were on the front pages of the New York Times. They made the San Francisco Chronicle. This was the age of yellow journalism, which I love, and we're back in it, by the way, unfortunately. But it's fascinating for a historian to pour through yellow journalism stories, and I just got really into it, and I thought, this has got to be a book. Just giant sucking noise, right? 5 years later, there's this book. So that's how I came to write the book, and I was frustrated for years by this Koresh, connection. Is he connected to David Koresh of Waco? So when Jeff showed up on campus with this book, it was astounding. This is proof that David Koresh plagiarized from Cyrus Teed, and we'll get to why that's important, right? Other than just.
I do want to point out that a month ago I did a program in Waco, and Lyn came to Texas. So she's actually held and read the real book.
With the underlinings and everything. What was your second part of your question?
Well, I was just going to say, you talk some about Cyrus Teed, but let me ask it this way, and I don't know if this is something you can speak to completely, but one of the differences between the two is that all of the inside the Earth pseudoscience was, as I understand it, not present with the Branch Davidians. How much of Cyrus Teed's thing was about prophecies, and how much of it was about the science or the pseudoscience?
He promised his people that he could bridge science and religion, and that was a very attractive thing to people, because if you think about the 1880s, 1890s, there were all of these scientific discoveries that were kind of interfering with faith, right? When people don't like cognitive dissonance, it can be physically painful. We never experience cognitive dissonance today, but back then it was a big deal. And so Cyrus Teed came along and said, hey, I can bridge these two things. Now, interestingly, what made its way to Waco, the pseudoscience didn't make its way into David Koresh and Lois Rodin's theology. But when I was in Waco on February 4th, this guy who's a collector, he wandered up with this like NPR tote bag, right? And he's got all this stuff from like tickets and David Koresh's business card and just very odd ephemera from Waco from 30 years ago. And he pulls out this book. It's the Cellular Cosmogony.
Which was Cyrus Teed's bestseller.
That was his masterpiece of pseudoscience. People called this a masterpiece of pseudoscience. This was his hollow earth theory, all laid out. And I thought, well, clearly Lois Rodin wouldn't try to sell anybody on the hollow earth theory. That's just too way out there, right? The theologies, yeah. So I just figured the cellular cosmogony, the hollow earth theory had been stripped out and it had not made its way to Waco. And here's this guy with the tote bag, right, just pulling it out, saying, what do you know about this? Is this valuable? You know, and I'm like, I don't know. So yeah, it seems that they stripped out the pseudoscience, but it seems that David Koresh, that Lois Rodin was very aware of it. So anyway, so Teed was all about bridging religion and science, and not afraid of pseudoscience. Lois Rodin, I think, came along. She must have been aware of the pseudoscience and said, that'll never sell. we're going to go with the theology though instead.
And as I understand it, the way that Cyrus T died began with what his followers considered to be Babylon attacking him.
Yeah.
Fair to say?
Yeah, so Babylon, in the Bible, Babylon was a place, right, where King Cyrus freed the Jews from Babylon. Babylon, the way Teed thought about it, and then later David Koresh, Babylon symbolized government or any major organization that was trying to stomp on your rights, especially your religious rights. So Babylon meant like evil or government. So Teed, the Koreshanes at one point formed their own political party, and they were a threat to the people of Fort Myers. And so the people of Fort Myers weren't so fond of the Koreshanes, and it built tension. The Koreshanes started their own newspaper to kind of defend themselves against what is now the Fort Myers News Press, the Fort Myers Press. There was a huge press war, again, yellow journalism. You know, I'm just geeking out at this point. And so when Cyrus T came to town, one day in 1906, there had been this just dumb technical misunderstanding about someone's wife. Anyway, so he came to town, and the town marshal got involved, saw that Teed was there, this controversial figure who no one liked, and the town marshal took a swing at him. And that started a street brawl. And Teed got hit in the head and lost his glasses. And it was bad, right? So he did not die from that blow to the head. He died from other things, and it's kind of a mystery. But the followers very much believed that he was dying because of that blow to the head and because of Babylon, right? The town marshal, the town represented Babylon, stepping on his rights and on the Koreshanes' rights. There was voter disenfranchisement involved. So David Koresh had a very similar view toward Babylon, which I'm thinking he might have gotten from Teed in part, that his people were to fight the forces of Babylon, and that they were going to die at the hands of Babylon. And Teed's followers believed that too, that eventually they were going to die at the end times in this great battle. And that battle never really happened except for a street fight with Marshall in
Street fight in downtown Fort Myers.
Right, a street fight in downtown Fort Myers. And I know exactly the building that happened in front, the cigar barn, right there, the cigar barn. Okay. So in Teed's case, it was just kind of a mini end times battle in front of the cigar barn. But in David Koresh's case, they did fight the forces of Babylon, and they too were willing to die because they thought the end times were at hand.
One of the things that I think is appropriate to mention now is that one of the reasons we're here tonight is to celebrate the role of Florida Gulf Coast University. It's one of its most distinguished faculty members, and the archives and archivists here. How many students do we have who are attending school here right now? I hope that all of you can feel tonight a little bit of pride, or a whole lot of it. You are attending a school that, because of the faculty you have here, the archives you have here, you have changed the understanding of an important event in American history. That does not happen too often. It would not have happened without the amazing archives you have on this campus. This is the 25th book I've written. My rule is if you can't write good, write a lot. And I have been all over this country and quite a few foreign countries looking through collections, archives everywhere. I have never found better archivists to work with. I have never found a collection that more clearly spoke to history than what you have here. Lyn, why don't you read the names of the people we've got here tonight from the archives who are so important.
So, and if you guys want to stand when I call your names.
I tell you what, the archivists never get the attention they deserve.
We need to
Tonight
give a
was-
parade, actually. Can we just give a parade? The archivists.
Oh, just read their names.
Okay. So, Melissa Vanderberg could not be here tonight, and she's such a badass. She's the director of the Archives and Special Collections. Bailey Rogers.
Where's Bailey?
Emily Murray. Is Emily here? Victoria Jones. Jonathan Farquhar. He couldn't make it. Okay, Olivia Bechtel. And I'm really haunted that I've not gotten a name or forgotten someone. So please stand up if I didn't call your name and you're in the archives department. We'll clap for you too. No? Okay, give them all another round of applause. And I have a story, and then I do want to get to why the plagiarism is so important, right? But I do have a magical story about the archives, and actually I close my book with this. When Cyrus Teague was first told by the angel that he was sent to redeem humanity, he really tried, right? And he struck out for 13 years. And then he got an invitation to Chicago to speak to the National Mental Scientists Convention, and he took off. For some reason, there was just magic in the air. There was also the smell of candy in the air because he preached in a converted church that had a candy factory in the basement. Pretty weird, right? Can you imagine listening to a lecture and smelling candy as you're listening to a lecture, right? I'm glad that they didn't serve candy in the back because we would get no attention at all. So this guy's doing faith healings, and people are hooting and hollering, and he's reading from his Bible, and he has a chart of the brain that he's showing everyone. And there's candy, like chocolate boiling in the basement, and caramel and rose and all of this great stuff. So I did all this research to find out what kind of candy. I'm always telling my students, don't just write that there was candy in the basement. You have to know what smells are going to carry up from the basement to the preaching site. So he was preaching from his Bible, and they were smelling candy, and that was his big break in Chicago. That was when he finally started building followers. Well, so I wrote the scene. I was really happy I had the details, and then years passed, and I was at the archives with Melissa Vanderberg, and she pulls out this Bible from the 1880s, and I'm not allowed to touch it because she hasn't processed the archives yet. So I'm with my hands behind my back, and I'm looking at it, right? And she's like, don't touch it. You look so excited that if I let you loose in this place, it's gonna be torn up. So all I had, sense-wise, was my sense of smell. And I bent over the Bible and I smelled it, right? I took it in with my eyes and I bent over and I smelled it. What do you think it smelled like? You know better than that. What kind of candy? Rose cream. Caramel. I shit you not. And so Melissa and I call it the Candy Bible. It is available for sniffing by appointment. I asked her if it was okay to announce that because I didn't want to start a stampede. You can make an appointment to go sniff the Candy Bible if you would like to. That comes straight. Why is that funny? Okay, so anyway, that was a big magical archive day for me. They're kind of way off track, but that was a fun moment.
One of the things about the archives that has been significant for me is I've been going around the country talking about this. It may come as a shock to some of you in Florida, as I find it so hard to believe moving to Texas, but there are people out there who are not especially interested in facts unless the facts fit whatever prejudices and beliefs they may have in their lives. Anyway, I had the occasion 2 weeks ago to do C-SPAN Book Talk. I don't know if you ever watched Book Talk, but they sandbagged me at the Tucson Festival of Books. I had to do 2 straight hours live, and it was viewer call-in. So some of our
unscreened callers.
some of our special citizens wanted to call and say a few words. You know, and I would be sitting there trying desperately not to think about the fact that they didn't tell me it was going to be 2 straight hours of live TV. I thought it was going to be maybe 10 minutes, and I had 2 Coke Zero Sugars just before I went on the set. And let me tell you folks, it was the longest 2 hours I have endured in my life. And a gentleman came on. He was actually from Tennessee, and he said, "This man is a liar. Every word in his book is a lie." And I'm polite. "Well, sir, I'm just wondering, could you please tell me, where in my book you found a lie?" "Oh, I haven't read it. I don't need to read it. You made it all up." And people wonder, besides just the information we get to see in an archive that we can bring into a book, well, isn't that all that the archives do? And it isn't. Because even though when I'm speaking to this gentleman, one of the few, in America with IQ in a single digit, perhaps a negative digit, in my book notes, in Lyn's book notes, anytime reputable historians use archives, we are able to specify the exact document, the date of that document, where in a specific archive that document is stored, that anyone who cares does not have to take our word for it. What the archives are the absolute final last word, where the materials you have on hand settle it. And so to this gentleman from Tennessee, I did not recommend he go to hell. I recommended he go to Fort Myers. Please, all of you in this room who are part of this school, have friends at this school, faculty of this school, you absolutely have something precious here. It really matters. The archivist sitting back there in that far row, the things you do, the work you do makes a difference. Lyn and I are not sitting here without you. And I hope to high heaven this school and its administrators and this community value what you have got here. And would you like to know why? Just yesterday, I finished talking to a production company that I had never heard of. They have to do with Netflix, and they were bragging they had done this program I had never heard of. What was the name of it, Lyn? Something to do with squid? The Squid Game. Anyway, this outfit, they're called Garden Productions in England. They've been asked by Netflix to do the 2nd season of something called The Squid Game, and I still don't know what the heck it is. Apparently it's interesting to people who are younger than me. But the one they want to do after that is a multi-part documentary based on my book. And they want to start by coming to Fort Myers, Florida, and Florida Gulf Coast University. That means you guys are going to get international recognition for the work you do.
No pressure.
Well, all right. Hey, see, we said come tonight. It'll be worth it. There you go. I don't want to get the the story Lyn is telling here, lost in the praise. I just want to make sure everybody here understands what you've got here. And it is special. And I'm grateful to it, and I always will be. And now, back to the star of our show.
I had something pop into my head while you were talking about archives. We're talking about an event that took place that was a big event in American history that was reframed because of things that were found from long ago that were physical things. Are you concerned about future historians maybe not having as much access to physical things?
Absolutely, I am. And digital is amazing. Like, as a researcher, I love
You
it.
can't hold it in your hand and know that it was it.
You can't see how hard somebody pressed on the paper when they were writing, you know? I mean, there's just something about the physical that is huge. And if I come across a digital archive and it's good and it's what I need, I'm gonna go there, right, to see the physicality. But yeah, of course, I agree that the physical aspect is disappearing.
The thing that's important about keeping the physical documents, the physical items, people can find it easier to deny history, to deny facts, if they're just looking at something on a computer screen that they can alter or someone else could alter with a single touch of the key. The more we get into a culture, a cycle in America, where we're being told there are alternative facts, that I don't care what the book says, I know what's better. To be able to not only hold a thing, but to be able to use it in demonstration of a truth, nothing will ever match that. And for all of you who care about history, who care about truth, one way you can be a fighter for that cause is to support the archives at your school, in your local historical society. There's a guy back there named Lyn Millner, who's president of the board of, was it the Southwest Florida?
Southwest Florida Historical Society.
Historical
And we
Society.
have 3 other members right here too.
Right. And when I was working on the Vagabonds book,
Kelly Marhenke and Sean?
Stephen Schomburg.
Stephen Schomburg, who I just met recently.
Well-
They're members of the Historical
well, when I
Society.
was working on the Vagabonds book about Ford and Edison, I had called this guy I'd never met or heard of him, Lyn Millner. Okay, I thought you died in a plane crash, World War II, but good for you still being here. I was hoping there might be something in their archives that might be helpful to me. Ford and Edison made their first famous summer car trip, actually in the winter, from Fort Myers out into the Everglades. And one of the big questions was, what route did they take in? We didn't have all these nice roads yet. And Glenn said that there were a number of plat maps from those years at the society's little building they had. And we looked, and we found a plat map showing little side roads, and it matched perfectly what Edison and Ford had described, and my photographer and I were able to get in the car and go out and see the same things. While we're praising the archives here at the school, we're praising all organizations that try to preserve these artifacts, because when they do it, they really are making history real. I couldn't write my books without groups like that. Lyn is going to write any number of fine books over the next years, and she's going to need archives. Like I said, no pressure, I'm just telling you. But I think probably what we want to do a little more now is talk about Koresh and Teague and some of the craziness. You want to hear crazy stories, right? Well, all right, Lyn.
You want crazy stories about Cyrus Teague?
Everything he did was crazy. Just
He was buried in a bathtub.
Buried in a bathtub. Okay, we'll start there. Do you want to start with buried in a bathtub? So one of the odder stories about Cyrus Teague, and one of the most misunderstood, I think, is that in 1908, when he died, his followers believed he was coming back And so they put him in a bathtub that had been made to his dimensions, a zinc bathtub made to his dimensions, and they had him out on Fort Myers Beach, tip of Estero Island, at what was called La Perita, which meant, I think it was their retreat. And so they opened the windows of the structure because it was, there was a dead body. This is amusing, some of you. So they waited. And one of the things that I found in the archives was journals and letters that they wrote as they watched his dead body and waited for him to come back. And then I found photographic negatives of the body. And that was one moment where when I saw that they had taken photographs on Christmas Day, I thought they really believed. I talked to my students about having a 3-word focus, subject, verb, object, for anything I write. I had a 3-word focus for my 300-page book, and it was followers believed teeth. It's about belief, right? So when I saw those photographic negatives of Teed's dead body in a bathtub, and if you're really curious, there's a book over there, and it includes
It's for sale.
photos. It's for sale. There is a photo of Teed in a bathtub. But anyway, so there were letters about, we're seeing hieroglyphics on his body. We're seeing a little arm bud of a new arm form underneath his existing arm. It sounds silly, but they really believe. And if you think of, maybe you can think of things that we have believed today or not so long ago that turned out to be very wrong. So they kept him above ground in the bathtub for 5 days and waited for him to come back to life. The health department came and declared him quite extinct and ordered that he be entombed, and so they built a tomb, put it on Fort Myers Beach, left a note inside the tomb saying, he's coming back, right? And then the tomb was washed out to sea, washed out to the Gulf in the 1921 hurricane. A few of his bones were found on the beach, and they put those away in the post office, like you do. And then the post office was burned down in the 1930s, and so nothing survives of Teed. I have to say, before I found that out, all these archives were coming out in artifacts and ephemera, and I was hoping we would open a safe one day at the College of Life, and there would be Teed's skull. I believe the archivist found his teeth or his dentures, right? Yeah. So they came up to me at one of these presentations, and they had this tin soapbox, and they shook it and said, "Guess what's in here?" They know to just tease me mercilessly because they always have really interesting stuff. Guess what's in here? Shake, 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 shake. His dentures, and I'm like, that's great. So we're still finding out very odd things about Teed, but I think there are a lot of silly stories, right? He's an odd story, and I think it's important though to really focus down on the fact that the Koreshanes show us to ourselves. These people sacrificed everything to follow this man down here. They were incredibly industrious. They weren't dumb. They studied Latin. They knew lots of different languages. They had a drama troupe. They had bands. They played, Faust. They loved opera. They weren't dumb. And yet, we see them with these, what we think of as crazy beliefs. My hollow earth theory, and I realize this is crazy, is that education, I've really devoted my life to education, right? Part of the reason why is I think education can fix crazy, right? Like if you, and I realize this, it's okay to laugh, I just feel like if you educate yourself, you won't fall for stupid shit, right?
It's that kind of eloquence that makes her a great
Well, it turns out that education isn't enough, and in the Koreshan culture, they were very educated, but they also, they wanted to believe things, and so they did. And when we look today at this culture, how many of us can say that we have an easy time letting go of our beliefs, right? They're part of our identity. At one time, we thought it was a good idea to drain the Everglades, and how'd that work out? So there are a lot of things that the Koreshanes teach us about ourselves, and then the tie-in really, to me, with Waco, is that those beliefs came into competition with each other, and we're not talking to each other today, right? We tend to dismiss people that don't believe the way that we believe, and that can have really disastrous and fatal consequences. And Jeff writes about that in his book, about how the FBI, the media, the Koreshanes, nobody was talking. And that can teach us about what's happening today. And I think there are terrible consequences happening because of it.
One of the hardest things for me in writing this book, what I try to do in my books is not say what I think. Find the facts, put them down, and let readers make up their own minds. But for a while, I had trouble taking seriously some of the things that the Branch Davidians believed. I was horrified by some of their practices. David Koresh had multiple wives, and he was essentially raping little girls as young as 10 years old. And my religious tolerance for someone else's beliefs kind of draws up real short when something like that is involved. And yet I'm talking to very intelligent survivors of Waco, Branch Davidians, who to this day, 30 years later, believe that David Koresh was the Lamb of Revelation, that the things that happened in Waco were those first steps of the prophecy. And to this day, they wait because they truly believe David, as he prophesies, will return to earth in somewhat different form. This is when the surviving Branch Davidians will finally be rewarded for believing God's word, being the only ones who did, and will become leaders in the 1,000-year kingdom. And then I was talking to one of the survivors named Kathy Schroeder, who I got along with very well and who now despises me, as do most of the other surviving Branch Davidians. They very much resent my writing about Cyrus T, and they are kind of like the man from Tennessee. When I said, you don't have to believe me that David plagiarized all this. You can look for yourselves. It's all there, and they all said the same thing. I don't have to look. I know David, I was there. And so I'm sitting with Kathy Schroeder in her living room. She's dandling her 2-year-old granddaughter on her knee as she describes the privilege of being one of David Koresh's wives, and how when he chose his individual wife for each night after Bible study, he would honor her by giving her a private Bible study as they were having sex. And I'm not the kind of person who really likes to hear a lot of these graphic descriptions. And I was sort of sitting there waiting for her to kind of get through it, because oh my God, don't tell me, oh, she told me. And, it would go on. And then she said, okay, I'm going to give you an example of how we lived for God. And this, when she told me this, and I thought about it, it helped me understand how they did believe. Kathy Schroeder had a husband and 4 little boys when she came to Mount Carmel. She was immediately separated from her husband and told, you're not married to him anymore, you're married to David. And she's got the 4 little boys. And the children were expected to observe all the same strict biblical rules that the parents were. Everything every Branch Davidian, child, adult, did every day had to be based on something in Scripture. Otherwise, you just couldn't do it because it would be sinful. And Kathy said one of her little boys, she thought it was the 5-year-old, was playing outside of Mount Carmel one day, and it's built on this barren hill in Waco. I mean, there's nothing but fire ants and bugs and prickly stuff. And her little boy was playing with a grasshopper, and of course what happens when little 5-year-old boys play with grasshoppers is inevitable. He killed it. He brought the grasshopper in and showed it to his mother. And she made him eat it. Because in Leviticus, the Bible teaches you may only kill a living thing in order to eat it. If he had not eaten the grasshopper, his mother believed that would have been a sin against God, and his soul would have been at risk. Think about that for a minute. We can all sit here and go, oh, good. But these are people who devoutly believed David Koresh was who he said he was. Believed it so much that the ones who are still alive, and there's only about a half a dozen now, only 9 adults got out that day at Mount Carmel. Everybody else died, including 23 kids. They still believe it's true just as devoutly as those of us who go to church on Sunday believe the things that we're hearing from the ministers. And we can disagree with them, and I do. And we can think some of the things that were allowed to happen at Mount Carmel are awful and unforgivable, and they are. But let's never doubt that every moment they were doing what they believed God wanted, because David was his prophet. And David Koresh was making these prophecies because decades earlier in Estero, and even before that in Chicago, a man named Cyrus was declaring things that we may giggle when we hear it, that there were people who believed.
Right, and what's so disturbing to me is that the proof was here, right? The FBI had the proof. Had they sent it in, this was a dangling thread. Somebody pulls this dangling thread, it's going to come apart. One of the reasons they followed David Koresh was because they believed he was getting messages directly from God. That was the main reason to follow him, right? And to find out that he was plagiarizing instead from this obscure prophet in Estero, they would have walked out. 80 people did not have to die.
And all these years since, the conspiracy theories that drive a lot of the armed militias, that Waco is proof that the United States government just decides to obliterate or oppress anyone that makes an official unhappy. One of the things that I've tried to stress is what happened in Waco was not collaborative malfeasance on the part of government agencies. It was individual ineptitude and bad decisions. Just as those folks, like our friend in Tennessee, don't want to know the truth. We still have to have it out there, folks. We still have to make it available. Now, one other thing, because I know we're getting towards the end here, and our gracious host is in a minute going to ask you to ask some questions. And I just need to be honest for a minute, okay? I started my book tour for my Waco book January 23rd. I've been home for only about 4 days since, and I'm not going to be home again until after April 19th. During that time, I've done some programs all around the country, and there's always been the opportunity for people to come to the microphone and ask questions. And what I want to be able to do when I'm in New York City, day after tomorrow, and then in Boston and everything, somebody will say, who asked the best questions anywhere in the country? And you know what we got to say, you guys have to come through here. So there is absolutely no pressure, but we're counting on you. Would you like to invite people to ask questions?
Real quick, there's one other thing I want to make sure gets told because it's a really interesting aspect of this story in terms of how it connects to the Proud Boys, etc. The bombing of the Edward R. Murrow building in Oklahoma City by Timothy McVeigh happened 2 years to the day after the last day of the siege, and that wasn't a coincidence, right?
In my book, you will see we have a picture of Timothy McVeigh sitting on the hood of his truck outside Mount Carmel during the siege, peddling anti-government bumper stickers. When McVeigh was captured after the bombing of the federal building 2 years to the day after the fire at Mount Carmel, he said it was in retaliation for Waco. We have to put back in the government's face what they do to us. That's why he thought it was wonderful that children had died in that bombing, because that's going to show the government just how bad the government had been in Waco. For the Proud Boys, for the Oath Keepers, for a lot of the militant groups of today, their leaders, if you look at their websites, will all say they decided you needed to be ready to violently oppose the government because of Waco. What if they ever try to do it again? And not coincidentally, the person who may be the subject of my next nonfiction book, I'm not sure, I'm thinking about it, on the 5th anniversary of the burning of Mount Carmel, there was a gathering in Waco on the site of the old burned building, a memorial service for the Branch Davidians who died. And a number of people who sympathized with the Branch Davidians had contributed money to start rebuilding Mount Carmel. And Clive Doyle, who was one of the survivors among the Branch Davidians, was sort of master of ceremonies at the services. He had been every year for the memorial service and would be until his death a year ago. And a burly, bearded man, described later as an internet broadcaster from his garage in Austin, Texas, jumped up, snatched the microphone, and said, if I have anything to do with it, and I can get there, the next time there's another Waco, we're not going to be building a church. And he announced that from now on he would reveal all the government conspiracies. And that's when Alex Jones first got national attention. So if you're thinking what mattered in Waco, and some of the origins of what happened in Waco have nothing to do with our lives today, think again, folks.
All right, on that light note, let's start the Q&A. Would anybody like to, I guess this microphone is probably live if you want to come up, or it might be just a small enough room that if you talk loud. But
come on, I know you can do it.
Was also with the Alex Jones thing, was that where you really started raising money as fundraising to rebuild?
That was one of the first things. Mount Carmel and his complaints about it, some of the money raised actually went a long way towards the establishment of InfoWars. It was sort of his seed money.
It's kind of where he learned how to pump that audience.
Yeah, and he hasn't unlearned it since.
So it seems like the Koreshanes commitment to celibacy or supposed commitment didn't translate to Waco.
Right, that didn't make its way over to celibacy. But there were certain sexual tenets, I mean, having to do with David Koresh taking multiple wives and underage.
Yes, sir.
So I don't remember the history of Waco as far as when David Koresh actually got killed. But the way you worded your answer, if that booklet got in there, it could have maybe saved people. What's the logic of being able to separate those people from David Koresh if he was alive at that time?
Koresh was allowing anyone who wanted to leave Mount Carmel to actually go outside. And over the course of the 51 days, about a dozen adults and about 20 children actually did go out. Everyone else who stayed was staying because they wanted to be with the Lamb at the moment when he would pass and everybody would be translated up to heaven to come back. These were the true hardcore believers above all others.
Was he allowing the FBI to come in to the building?
No one was allowed to come into the building except his lawyer, Dick DeGaring, another lawyer who was representing one of the Branch Davidians. They weren't allowed by the FBI to communicate with the outside world. The thought being that if some of the Branch Davidians who were so certain that David Koresh was the original, the only Lamb of the book of Revelation, and everything he was saying could only have come from God. And then, for instance, page 34. Well, one of the things I did when I first saw this book was, I sat down with it. I have about 80 hours of David Koresh's tapes to his followers, his Bible studies, to see if I could find any similarities. Came up with 74 word for word. One of his big preachings was that the Lamb must be a man of sin. That he was taking on the sin of mankind. And that therefore the Lamb, Koresh, would actually have what you might think were a lot of personal flaws. From wanting to have sex with little girls, to being the only one allowed to smoke, because there's a line in Scripture, and the smoke came out of God's nostrils. Koresh had air-conditioned room when nobody else did. He got to drive a nice car. And he was doing all these things, he said, because he was a sinful Messiah. That's what the Bible demanded. And here on page 34 is Cyrus team announcing that the Lamb and the Messiah will be a man of sin because he has taken on the burden, word for word. So if some of these Branch Davidians, not all of them, it wouldn't have happened that way, but just think even if one of them had said something's wrong here and walked out as they would have been allowed to do, one less person would have died. Wouldn't that at least have been worth the FBI following through?
Yeah, well, it just seems like if he saw that book coming through, he'd die for it, so nobody.
He asked for it to be brought in. That's the crazy
Yeah,
thing he did.
because
Yeah,
one of
clarify
the-
the Lowe's Road.
One of the ongoing mysteries, is did he know he was plagiarized? Lois Roden, we know, consciously plagiarized. And she's the one who was teaching Koresh. And I'm betting, though you can't know for sure, and I point that out in the book, that rather than David Koresh seeing this book, Lois Roden could say to him, there's a vision, but it's a vision for you. You're the greatest prophet. Vernon Wayne Howe, who became Koresh, I believe since he was 10 that God spoke to him. He thought he was going to be a prophet, and people like that, I mean, if he hears you are going to be the greatest prophet of them all, he's going to accept it and just take it from there. And like I said, now I have shown this book to surviving Branch Davidians. I have discussed it with them, and they just don't want to know. That probably would have been the reaction of most. But if it would save one life, wouldn't it have been worth it?
I was going to Lyn Millner. You mentioned twice how you said during the Bible you can see how hard that you pressed on the Bible, the underlines. I was wondering, how would that contrast with the digital, where you said,
You can actually put your finger, you have to wear gloves in an archive, but I could just put my finger and feel the indentation of how hard he pressed.
like what context does that give you?
So the context would be that I knew what he was emphasizing. It taught me more just from a visceral level about his beliefs.
And also, I think what he's getting at is versus a digital archive. It gives it an authenticity because it would be a lot harder to forge something that was like that than a digital archive.
Plus, it's just cool.
Oh, yeah.
It's just really freaking cool. Yeah, but good question.
One of the big weaknesses in trying to use digitized material as proof of the fact is there is so much incorrect information out there on the internet.
Really?
Yeah, there's actually people who say your book
I think the world might be ready for a inside the world movement. With the internet, it could happen. Any other questions?
Yes, so one thing to think about is, this goes out to both of you, who, studied both of these groups extensively. It's clear, the Koreshanes are very interesting, but from what I understand, relatively harmless. It was mostly a voting dispute that led to fist fight. So we understand the Koreshanes is just interesting, and we understand the Branch Davidians as a tragedy that's influenced conspiracy theories the last 30 years. What got lost in translation that caused one to just be a cool historical site and the other to burn to the ground?
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
question.
I have just heard.
The best question.
Oh, there it
And
is.
thank you.
There
This man has saved the honor of Fort Myers. Keep it for a day, buddy. You want to start?
Oh, gosh, I've thought about this a
No,
lot.
I think that's a great question.
Yeah, no, we do, we have to think.
The thing, to me, it would be that Cyrus Teed had tried any number of guises to become prominent, to become important, to become powerful. Koresh happened to be the one that brought him the most recognition. Even before David Koresh was part of the Branch Davidians, the Branch Davidians broke off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, the beliefs include that the end times are coming and we're all going to be judged. And the Branch Davidians had broken away because they thought even the Seventh-day Adventists were too worldly. So where Cyrus Teed is simply putting on a different hat and attracting some people to that. The people who follow David Koresh, for all their lives, they've been believing the prophet was going to come, going to lead them against Babylon, and they personally were going to be involved in the end time. That was their lifelong rock-hard faith. That's why he could appeal to them, I think, in a different way than Cyrus.
Yeah, and Teed was really kind of patching together lots of different spiritualism, theosophy, tons of different belief systems. And also you've got the media in Waco, and this was drama, I mean, this was huge media drama.
And they're sitting there for 51 days when very little is happening. And their editors and their producers all want a great story for that day that beats whatever anybody else is putting out there. So you tend to see some pretty bizarre stories. Teed wasn't doing what he did, or his end didn't come in the spotlight of everybody around the world paying attention. But again, what a great question.
That was a fantastic
Can I do
question.
one more thing just real quick? Because tonight we're celebrating people. We're celebrating Lyn as we should. We're celebrating the archives of the great archivists. We do have someone in this room. Every book I write is in part inspired by him and his work. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction. He is considered one of the great writers of this or any other era. And I will tell all of you frankly that to me he is the greatest living American writer. He is here tonight, and if you like my books, you have him to thank in large part. Can we please welcome the great Robert Olin Butler?
I'm so
sorry,
happy
just
I
had to
didn't
do
realize
that.
he was on the front row.
Okay.
I've got one more question. I know the answer to it, but explain how. So, as I understand it, the Koreshan Historic or Koreshan State Park, they have rangers, docents, I don't know what they're called, and for ages they have when asked about the connection, said no. But that's changing, or
Oh,
changed,
that has
right?
changed, yeah, they are eager to talk about that connection now, because we have the proof, again, like, no, I wasn't willing to stick my neck out, you know, as a journalist and say David Koresh plagiarized, right? So we had to be very careful about that. Now that we have the proof, yes, we have sat down, Ron Westcott is here in the audience, and he leads the docents who give the tours at Koreshanes State Park. And so we've had lots of meetings of the mind and had to kind of retrain, and so they're very eager to talk to people. It's a great time to visit the site. It's just such an exciting time to visit the site.
Folks, Lyn Millner has changed our understanding of an important event in U.S. history. And I know she would love to sign books for you.
And he can sign a few too. And also Cyrus T happened to leave his signature in lots of places, as you can imagine. So it was an easy matter to grab one of those signatures and have it made into an ink stamp. He could not be here tonight. So he will be able to sign your book if you bring one up as well.
Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.